This is part two of a two-part sermon on the resurrection. And you may ask, why the resurrection in the middle of the fall, right before we enter into Advent? But that is the movement of the liturgical year, is that it builds to a culminating point right before the church year starts at the first Sunday of Advent, which is a couple of weeks away. And so we have this revisiting, remembering of the culmination of the story as the story is about to begin again for the new year. So since this is part two of my sermon, I need you to bear with me while I do a previously on moment here. So, previously, we considered the post-grave belief in resurrection, realizing that before it was associated with Jesus himself, it was one belief among many about what happens in the end of it all. Like in our own time, many people believed then in many different things in Jesus' time about what happens after life, right? There were those who believed that once we die, that's it. Body, mind, and soul kaput, done, was nice while it lasted, game over. There were those influenced by Greek philosophy who believed in the immortality of the soul, that when we die, the body returns to the earth and the soul drifts off to another world. Others believed in reincarnation, that our essence comes back in different material forms. You might remember in the Gospel of Mark, they refer to reincarnation. Some people wondered if John the Baptist was Elijah reincarnated. So it was one of the myriad of beliefs about what happens after this life. And then there was resurrection, the belief in resurrection, which is apparently what Jesus believed before it happened to him. He believed in it because we are privy to an argument he had about it with the Sadducees, which we talked about last week. Resurrection of the dead was one particular Jewish worldview with three claims to it: that after death there would be a bodily, physical return one day, that it would be corporate, a collective return in nature, and three, it wasn't individual or even purely human salvation, but would involve a renewal of all creation, a new heaven and a new earth. Now, as I mentioned last week, it's a beautiful claim that all this world is ultimately not dissipating into nothingness, but will be transformed, renewed, redeemed to wholeness, to beauty through love. But the big question is it true? That's where we left it last week, and I suggested I'll make something of a case for it this week, but I'm about out of time, so Judy's preaching next week, though. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm just going to set the stage a little bit further, because you can't talk about resurrection of the dead without also the Jewish belief at the same time that was held across the centuries of a Messiah to come to usher it in. So the Greek word for Messiah is Christ, as you know. And so no, Christ is not Jesus' last name, as Paul Raymeyer is fond of reminding us. But it is a title for Jesus Bar Joseph of Nazareth that indicates a belief in him as the Messiah, Jesus Christ. The one promised for centuries upon centuries to the Jewish people. To this day, we as Christians say Christ the Messiah has come. The Jewish people say they're still waiting. So the Messiah in Jewish worldview, as Jesus and the Jews around him would have understood it, the Messiah would have been one who would lead a great battle against Israel's enemies. This Messiah would come to restore the prominence of the temple, and once it had been restored, to rebuild it. This Messiah would bring Israel's history and the history of the world actually to climax and reestablish the Davidic monarchy and be God's representative on the earth in a new heaven and a new earth at the resurrection of the dead. So there were many around Jesus' time, before and after, who made claims to messiahhood, messianic claims. Historians speak of a man named Simeon ben Kosaba, who was hailed as the Messiah by many, and there were coins minted in his name with a restored temple on one of them, suggesting that through him the temple would be rebuilt and the line of David would be reestablished once a battle against the pagan world commenced, which was exactly what people were expecting in the role of the Messiah. But like almost every other messianic claim, Simeon was arrested and executed by the Romans for inciting rebellion, and it was pretty much the definitive refutation of the claim to be Messiah. Except in one single instance, this Jesus of Nazareth, who was also executed as a rebel, though he built no army and led no rebellion. He was executed as a rebel, but amazingly his death was no refutation of his messiahhood. In fact, it was understood, bizarrely enough, as integral to it. Which means, as N.T. Wright says in his book, Simply Christian, Why Christianity Makes Sense, means that Jesus' messianic claim is either the greatest hoax ever pulled on the human race, or because of the way his presence sits really at a fulcrum point for the turning of human history, at least Western human history, because we date our calendars by his presence, it's simply the truth of the matter. Either it's the greatest hoax ever pulled, or it's the truth of the matter. Jesus' death and burial should have been the end of the story, but that moment somehow, bizarrely, was understood by his followers as the beginning. Not just any beginning of a new religion or a new era, but a beginning on the order of the initial beginning, the Big Bang, which they weren't calling it then, but in their minds, the creation. It was on that order of things. Like the Big Bang has only ever happened once and so cannot exactly be absolutely verified, except that we are here somehow. The resurrection of Jesus was a new creation moment which has only ever happened once and so can't absolutely be verified, except that we're here in a church 2,000 years later. It is by all accounts amazing and remarkable that after the execution and death of Jesus, an entire community of people suddenly accepted things that up to that point had been unfathomable. So there were prophecies of the Messiah for many, many, many centuries prior to Jesus, but Jesus as the Messiah didn't lead a rebellion against Israel's enemies, didn't restore the temple, actually referred to the temple as his own body. He was executed, eliminated, and apparently didn't enter in, the mass resurrection of the dead. Except, even so, a large number of people, against all evidence to the contrary, were still convinced that he was the Messiah and not, in fact, dead. And that all of this wasn't developed in a closed room conversation around a table trying to figure out how to keep the dream alive, but that it sprung up almost immediately, which we know because we have letters from the Apostle Paul, who wrote only about 15 years after Jesus' death, and in them he speaks of the empty tomb and eyewitness accounts of a resurrected Jesus. Not a ghost Jesus, not a spiritual vision Jesus, but a glorified physical bodily resurrection of this man. All right, so there are 3 points to make about this, that Jesus was resurrected. So first off, there are many points to make, but 3 that I'm making today to try to make this case for the truth of it. So an empty tomb alone would not have made a stir, because it would be easily written off as robbery, that the body was stolen out of the grave and disposed of. But the empty tomb account was combined with eyewitness accounts of his actual presence, and not just a few. In 1 Corinthians, Paul wrote that Jesus appeared to some women, the disciples, and then to over 500 people among others. So this is written about 15 years after Jesus' death. Now, N.T. Wright makes the case that if Paul claimed this 15 years after Jesus' death in the Mediterranean culture at the time, which didn't exactly have the internet, but movement and travel was quite easy, there was no way such a claim could be sustained unless there were many who could verify it from their own experience. Over 500 experienced the resurrected Christ. Secondly, what sprang up immediately after Jesus' death was not simply a story that was written to fulfill the expectations that had been laid out, but something far, far stranger. The claim his followers were making was so outlandish, actually, backed up by such an odd combination of Hebrew texts that it would have been unimaginable beforehand. And namely, that the Messiah who was to come to redeem Israel was ultimately had to be tortured and killed and end his life in utter defeat. Not bringing back an army to set the world to rights and lift up Israel, but dying on a cross, executed on a cross. And then he himself, get this, would come back as a resurrected body. Now remember, belief in the resurrection was that it was bodily, but what else? That it was corporate, that it was communal, a communal rising. So nowhere was anyone thinking that the resurrection of the dead was going to happen to one man. And his followers understood that from this one man, all of creation would follow. Some of them, as you read through the scriptures, get it wrong. They thought it was really going to follow like within the next week or two. Didn't exactly happen. But the belief was that out of this one man's resurrection, the rest of the world would follow. And this belief did not come from ages of debate and discussion about who Jesus was, but it spread like wildfire 3 days after Jesus' death, this outlandish claim that the resurrection of the dead had just occurred in a single God-man. What? Furthermore, it is really unlikely that other Jews would have also accepted this suggestion that Jesus was somehow close enough to God to be the object of worship. And yes, there were those Jews who did not accept that. But there were a large number quickly who did. It would have been anathema and blasphemous for hundreds and hundreds of Jews to suddenly begin to place Jesus as a man executed on a cross as the center of their worship and insist that it was actually in keeping with Jewish theology and Jewish history. Not a departure from it, but a flowing out of it. That was their claim. It is difficult to explain how this would have been acceptable to so many people springing up out of nowhere, compelling such a following, unless, of course, it was simply the truth of the matter. So thirdly, it's worth noting that the resurrection accounts as they appear in the Gospels are so problematic on one particular detail so as to suggest its inclusion suggests the veracity of the story. All the Gospels say that the first people Jesus chose to appear to, all four of them, they differ on certain accounts, but they all say that the first people who Jesus chose to appear to were women. All the Gospels say that. During that time and for centuries afterward, women were of such low social status that for instance, their testimonies were not even admissible in court. For all the resurrection accounts to go out of their way to make the point that the first receivers of Jesus' resurrection were women, and thereby threaten the credibility of the accounts themselves significantly, would be craziness. Unless, again, it was simply the way it actually happened. And then one final point. The mathematician, physicist, theologian of the 17th century, Blaise Pascal, once said, "I believe those witnesses that get their throats cut." So not only did this idea spring up out of nowhere, and large groups believed something heretofore unheard of, but almost all the apostles and early Christian leaders were willing to sacrifice themselves for it, to claim the truth of it. For them, it was a truth that even the grave could not contain. Note they didn't kill for the truth. That's a significant difference in the start of this movement. They did not kill for this truth. Eventually, people did in a departure from Christ's teachings, I would suggest, obviously. But they were willing to sacrifice themselves before lifting a finger against anyone that threatened, because they were following the Messiah of love. So I know such rational arguments only get us so far. But those are some of the those are some of the kind of laying out of the rational arguments for the truth of the resurrection. But hopefully they at least give pause to the skeptic or the skeptical parts of ourselves, that it being simply the truth of the matter is as good an explanation as any for how in the world Christianity became a worldwide phenomenon of Jesus the Christ followers, and how we to this day sit in a Christian church and pray. But ultimately, we have to decide for ourselves beyond rational explanation if it's the truth of the matter, if it's a legitimate way to understand who we are and where all of this is going. Because that's what the truth of it claims. Like, this is the story of where it all came from and where it's all going. Timothy Keller, in his book, The Reason for God, Belief in an Age of Skepticism, says that he has said to his secular friends that even if they can't believe the resurrection is true, they should want it to be true. He explains many of them care about the poor and struggle against injustice and seek to alleviate hunger and disease and to care for the environment. And yet, if the material world is all an accident and the world and everything in it will eventually simply burn up in the death of the sun, what's the point? Why sacrifice for any of it if in the end nothing we do will ultimately make a difference? And he makes a good point, I think. What is the drive in us to make a difference and to improve upon what is broken and wrong in this world, unless it is a movement towards some state of fulfillment in the end, some beautiful consummation? And that's what the resurrection teaches, that there is a beautiful consummation in the end. Belief in the resurrection of Jesus says that what happened in the resurrection, the return to glorified life of this one Messiah man, was the first fruit of what will happen to all creation. Belief in the resurrection refuses to dismiss this material world as worthless and eventually being shed as irrelevant, but holds out for it the beauty of it, the expression of God's love in material form, to be what is redeemed as well. So what about our loved ones? What about their cremated remains or their dissolved bodies into the earth? Belief in the resurrection means that how we knew them and loved them in this life, how we held them and beheld them, is not fleeting, but it's how we will also know them in the world to come. Thank God. Belief in the resurrection says that there's the way things are supposed to be, there's the way things are, and we can, with faith and with hope, work along with God towards the way things are meant to be, knowing that in the end, God will together with us get us there. It's a beautiful thing. It's beautifully true. Even for those of us who are skeptics and wonder if it's true, as we march this road to Zion, may we learn to live as though it was.